How does a father lose two children and still kneel before the man who killed them? Was Thomas Boleyn a monster, or simply the last man left alive in Henry VIII's deadly game? He lifts his head and looks at his daughter. She is still alive, still intelligent, still unmistakably herself, and in a matter of hours, cold steel will end her. He turns his eyes away. There is his son, young, strong, the only male heir he will ever have. And he knows, just as clearly, he cannot save him either. This man is Thomas Boleyn, a courtier, a diplomat, a father. History usually remembers him as something else. A schemer, a man who traded his daughters for power, a father who pushed two women toward a king's bed and called it ambition. But pause there, because the man who stands here, watching both of his children walk toward death, has already lost everything that ambition is supposed to buy. The king responsible for this destruction is Henry VIII, a ruler whose authority reached beyond law, beyond marriage, beyond the human body itself. A king who decided who would live, who would be discarded, and whose blood was worth keeping. And the cruelty does not end with the executioner. Because after this, after his daughter is beheaded, after his son is condemned, Thomas Boleyn will continue to serve that same king. He will bow. He will sign documents. He will remain at court. That is the paradox. A family destroyed by royal power, and a father who survives by obeying it. History calls Thomas Boleyn the villain. But what if he saw the danger coming long before anyone else? What if he understood that his daughter's closeness to the king was not a triumph, but a death sentence waiting to be carried out? And if he knew, why couldn't he stop it? Thomas Boleyn was born around 1476 or 1477 into a family that was large, ambitious, and fragile in ways Tudor England rarely recorded with sympathy. He was the eldest surviving son of Sir William Boleyn and Margaret Butler, a woman whose lineage reached into Irish nobility, but whose inheritance did not guarantee security. The Boleyn household was crowded. At least 11 children were born into it. Several died young. This was not unusual for the period, but it was never neutral. Every burial left a mark. Every small grave narrowed the future. When Thomas married Elizabeth Howard, the daughter of the Earl of Surrey, the match looked respectable on paper. In reality, it brought little immediate comfort. Years later, in 1536, Thomas would look back on those early days and admit something stark. When he married, he had only £50 a year to support himself and his wife, as long as his father lived. Even by late medieval standards, that was thin, respectable, but precarious. Elizabeth bore children almost continuously, year after year, body after body. Most of those children did not survive. We know the names of only a few with certainty. Mary Boleyn, born around 1499, and Boleyn, born around 1500 or 1501. George Boleyn, born around 1504. Two more sons, Henry and Thomas, died so young that history remembers them only through the crosses on their graves in Kent. No portraits, no letters, no recorded voices, just markers in the ground. From the beginning, the Boleyn story is not one of glittering ascent, but of bodies that did not last. Children arrived, children disappeared, and survival was never guaranteed. The family lived initially at Blickling Hall, where money was tight and prospects uncertain. What Thomas possessed instead was something harder to measure and more dangerous to pursue: ambition. He was unusually well educated for a man of his standing. He could read and write fluently. He spoke French and Latin. He rode well. He handled a sword. And most importantly, he understood a truth that governed Tudor England more strictly than law or lineage. Proximity to power meant survival. In 1497, when rebels rose in southern England, Thomas fought on the side of King Henry VII, standing beside his father to suppress the uprising. It was not a glorious battle, but it was instructive. For the first time, Thomas tasted royal service, not as an abstraction, but as protection. When his father died in October 1505, everything shifted. The young family moved to Hever Castle in Kent, a place that would later be soaked in far darker memories. Thomas entered the king's household as an esquire of the body, a personal attendant to the monarch. He was close enough now to watch how power moved, who was rewarded, who vanished. By the time Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, Thomas Boleyn was already there, watching, learning, adapting. But it is crucial to understand what shaped that adaptability. Thomas did not come from safety. He did not grow up insulated from loss. He was formed in a household where children died quietly and money ran thin. From those early years, a lesson hardened into instinct. Security does not come from comfort. It comes from access. This is the foundation many later stories ignore. Before there were queens and accusations, before there were crowns and executions, there was a man who had buried children, counted coins, and learned that in Tudor England, survival was not inherited. It was negotiated, often at great cost. Thomas Boleyn's rise did not begin with charm or intrigue. It began with obedience. In 1497, when rebellion flared in southern England, Thomas stood with his father in defense of Henry VII. The revolt was crushed. Order was restored. And Thomas learned something essential. Loyalty was noticed, quietly, but permanently. This was his first exposure to royal service, not as spectacle, but as survival. No songs were written for men like him, but men like him were remembered. When his father died in October 1505, Thomas's world narrowed and sharpened. The family moved to Hever Castle in Kent. It was a step up in appearance, but not in certainty. Castles did not guarantee protection. Kings did. Thomas entered the royal household as an esquire of the body, a role that required physical proximity to the king. He dressed him, attended him, stood close enough to hear what was never meant to be recorded. In Tudor England, closeness was currency. When Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, Thomas Boleyn was already in position. At the coronation, he was honored as a Knight of the Bath, a ceremonial recognition reserved for men the crown considered reliable. It was a public signal. Thomas Boleyn was trusted. What followed was not sudden elevation, but steady accumulation. Land grants, income, a place at court that did not depend on a single favor, but on repeated service. By the early 1510s, Thomas had built something solid, something that could endure changes of mood, even changes of monarch. But his true strength did not lie in flattery or force. It lay in diplomacy. In 1512, Thomas was sent abroad as an ambassador, first to Margaret of Austria and her father, Emperor Maximilian. This was not ceremonial travel. These were delicate missions, requiring restraint, linguistic skill, and a talent for not offending the wrong person at the wrong time. Thomas impressed them, so much so that Margaret agreed to take his daughter and into her household, an extraordinary privilege that spoke not only to Anne's potential, but to Thomas's reputation. Courts did not open their doors to men they distrusted. The following year, 1513, Thomas accompanied Henry VIII to war in France. The English won the Battle of the Spurs, a minor but symbolically useful victory. Thomas was present, not as a commander, but as an observer of how kings turned violence into prestige. Then politics shifted again. France became an ally. War turned into marriage diplomacy. Henry VIII decided to send his teenage sister, Princess Mary, to France to marry the aging King Louis XII. Thomas maneuvered both of his daughters into the princess's household. He traveled with them and was brought from Margaret's court to join the entourage. This was not recklessness. It was preparation. Thomas was positioning his family within the gravitational field of power, close enough to benefit, but, he believed, far enough to remain intact. Meanwhile, his own career continued its quiet ascent. When his maternal grandfather, the Earl of Ormond, died in 1515, Thomas claimed the title for himself. His legal claim was weak. A distant cousin, Piers Butler, contested it. The dispute dragged on for years. But Thomas did not retreat. He was methodical, persistent, willing to argue his case repeatedly, not because victory was guaranteed, but because retreat meant disappearance. By 1516, Thomas stood as godfather at the baptism of Princess Mary, the infant daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. He held the canopy over the child, an honor reserved for men closest to the king's confidence. It was a moment heavy with symbolism. Thomas Boleyn, once nearly poor, now stood literally above the future of England. In 1517, he served as Sheriff of Kent. In 1518, he witnessed the Treaty of Universal Peace between France and England. Within weeks, he was named ambassador to France again. This is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. Henry VIII did not reward men he distrusted, and he did not repeatedly entrust sensitive negotiations to incompetents. Contemporary observers noticed this. King Francis I of France praised Thomas's conduct. Louise of Savoy, the king's mother, spoke warmly of his reliability. Even critics described him not as aggressive or ruthless, but as cautious. Timid, some said, not warlike. These were not the traits of a man eager to gamble everything on scandal or seduction. But caution, in the Tudor world, was not safety. It was delay. Thomas Boleyn was building a career on precision, not provocation. He believed, reasonably, that skill could protect a family, that diplomacy could insulate children from danger. What he did not yet grasp was how quickly the rules could change. Because Tudor power did not only reward competence, it devoured it when it became inconvenient. And Thomas Boleyn was now close enough to the throne to learn that lesson the hard way. In 1512, Thomas Boleyn was sent on a diplomatic mission that would quietly alter the fate of his family. He traveled to the court of Margaret of Austria, daughter of an emperor and one of the most powerful women in Europe, and to her father, Emperor Maximilian. These were not ornamental visits. Courts like Margaret's did not entertain incompetence. Diplomacy here required restraint, languages, judgment, and the ability to understand power without provoking it. Thomas succeeded, so completely, in fact, that Margaret agreed to take Thomas's daughter and Boleyn into her household. This was no small favor, and would not simply be sheltered. She would be educated, immersed in court etiquette, languages, music, and the subtle politics of proximity. She would live among princes and future rulers, including a young man who would later become Charles V, the most powerful monarch of his generation. For Thomas Boleyn, this was not a shortcut to power. It was a long-term investment. He was not preparing a daughter to be used. He was preparing her to survive. In 1513, Thomas accompanied Henry VIII to war in France. The campaign ended with the Battle of the Spurs, a brief clash that England framed as victory. But victory, in Tudor politics, rarely lasted long. International alliances shifted almost immediately. France, once the enemy, became a necessary partner, and Henry VIII turned from warfare to marriage diplomacy. His teenage sister, Princess Mary Tudor, was sent to France to marry the aging Louis XII. Once again, Thomas moved carefully, but decisively. He arranged for both of his daughters to join the princess's household. Mary Boleyn traveled with the English entourage, and was brought over from Margaret's court to join them in France. To later generations, this moment has often been twisted into accusation. 2 daughters, foreign courts, a powerful king. But that reading ignores the context Thomas was navigating. At Margaret's court, and had learned how power behaved. In France, she would learn how it was performed. This was education by exposure. Dangerous, yes, but also invaluable. For a young woman of modest means in Tudor England, there were few paths that led anywhere but obscurity or dependence. Education was not protection, but ignorance was certain ruin. And yet, this was where the risk began to sharpen. After Louis XII died, Princess Mary returned to England, and did not. She remained in France. Mary Boleyn stayed behind as well, entering the service of Queen Claude, the wife of Francis I. The French court was dazzling, cultured, sophisticated, and perilous. Whispers began to circulate. Mary Boleyn's name became entangled with rumors of excessive familiarity with powerful men, possibly even with the king himself. The transcript is careful here, and so must we be. There is no definitive proof, only the acknowledgement that by the time those rumors reached England, they carried weight. And Thomas Boleyn reacted, quietly, decisively. Around 1519 or 1520, he called Mary home. This moment matters, because if Thomas Boleyn were truly the kind of man history later accused him of being, a father eager to trade daughters for influence, France would have been an opportunity, not a danger. A connection to the French king was far more valuable than proximity to Henry VIII. Yet Thomas chose reputation over leverage. He removed Mary from a court that threatened to stain the family's name, even at the cost of political advantage. Power could be negotiated, scandal could not. And, meanwhile, remained abroad longer, continuing her education in a world shaped by dynastic calculation. She was learning languages, manners, music, but also restraint. The art of being seen without being consumed. This is the contradiction at the heart of Thomas Boleyn's choices. He was placing his daughter close to power precisely because he believed education could act as armor. But in Tudor Europe, armor did not stop kings. The same proximity that sharpened Anne's intelligence would later draw the attention of a man who did not interpret refinement as boundary, but as invitation. Thomas could not know that yet. In 1513 to 1514, when and moved between courts, Henry VIII was married, distracted, and still hopeful of producing a male heir with Catherine of Aragon. The danger was not obvious. It was not inevitable. And that is what makes this stage of the story so unsettling. Nothing here looks reckless. Nothing looks predatory. Nothing resembles a plan to sacrifice a daughter. Instead, it looks like something far more human and far more tragic. A father investing in education because he believes knowledge can protect. A diplomat trusting systems he understands. A man preparing his child for power without realizing that power, once noticed, does not let go. And Boleyn was not being thrown toward a king. She was being shaped for a world where kings decided what happened next. And once she entered that world, the exit would no longer belong to her, or to her father. When Princess Mary Tudor returned to England after the death of Louis XII, one Boleyn daughter went home with her. The other did not. Mary Boleyn remained in France, entering the household of Queen Claude, the wife of Francis I. On paper, it was a respectable appointment. Service to a queen. Protection under court etiquette. A continuation of the education Thomas Boleyn believed would shield his daughters from harm. In reality, the French court was not a classroom. It was a marketplace of attention. Francis I presided over a world that celebrated wit, beauty, and charm, but punished women when admiration turned into rumor. His court dazzled visitors. It also devoured reputations. And Mary Boleyn was young, foreign, unprotected by distance or discretion. Whispers began to move through the corridors. At first, they were vague, then persistent, then dangerous. Mary's name became associated with men whose notice could not be refused. According to the transcript, it was said she had caught the king's eye. What that meant, precisely, was never formally recorded, and that absence matters. Tudor history is crowded with assumptions where documents are silent. But in courts like Francis's, rumor alone could be fatal to a woman's future. What mattered was not truth. What mattered was repetition. By the time those whispers crossed the Channel and reached England, they had already done their damage. A young woman's reputation, once questioned, could not be repaired by denial. Silence only invited speculation. Thomas Boleyn understood this, and he acted. Around 1519 or 1520, he quietly summoned Mary home. No public confrontation, no denunciation, no attempt to spin scandal into advantage. He removed her from France. This decision cuts against the story history later told. If Thomas Boleyn were the cold architect of ambition popular culture prefers, a man willing to trade his daughters' bodies for influence, France would have been the perfect opportunity. A rumored connection to Francis I was more powerful than anything England could offer at the time. France was wealthy, militarily strong, politically central, yet Thomas chose withdrawal. He chose damage control. That choice matters because it exposes the fault line between power and survival. Thomas understood that scandal did not elevate families. It consumed them, especially when the subject was a woman. Mary's return was not celebrated. It was quiet, necessary, defensive, and it came too late to erase what had already been said. This is the first place where the Boleyn story turns unmistakably dark. Mary had not been accused of treason. She had not broken a law. She had not defied her father. She had simply been noticed. And in a royal court, that was enough. History often treats women like Mary as footnotes, useful examples of immorality or weakness. But the transcript insists on something colder. Mary's supposed familiarity existed in a world where refusal was not an option, where kings did not seduce, they selected. There is no evidence that Mary orchestrated her own downfall. There is only evidence that she could not stop it. And once a woman's name was damaged, the punishment followed her home. Back in England, Mary's prospects narrowed. Her education, connections, and service, everything Thomas had arranged, were suddenly liabilities. They made her visible. And visibility, for women, was always dangerous. This is where the Channel's core truth becomes unavoidable. Royal courts do not destroy women with verdicts. They destroy them with insinuation. And the men who benefit from that destruction rarely leave records. Thomas Boleyn faced a choice no father in Tudor England could win. Leave Mary in France, where rumors would continue to grow, possibly turning her into a permanent instrument of foreign influence. Or bring her home, damaged but alive, hoping distance might soften judgment. He chose the second. It was not mercy, it was containment. But even containment had consequences. By calling Mary back, Thomas effectively closed one door while unknowingly opening another. England was smaller, the court tighter, the king closer. Mary returned to a place where Henry VIII would soon begin to notice her. And when an English king noticed a woman, there were no foreign borders left to hide behind. This is why Part 4 matters. Not because it proves Thomas was virtuous, but because it proves he was not reckless in the way history accuses. He did not celebrate rumor. He did not exploit it. He reacted to it, because he understood how quickly a woman could be ruined without ever being charged. Mary Boleyn's body does not leave scars in the record, but her reputation does. And reputation, in Tudor politics, was a form of capital women were forced to spend without consent. The men around her, kings, courtiers, observers, moved on untouched. Mary did not. By the time she crossed back into England, the lesson had already been written into her life. A woman's name could be destroyed without proof. A king's desire required no defense. And fathers, no matter how well-connected, could only react after the damage was done. This was not the last time Thomas Boleyn would learn that lesson, but it was the first time it became impossible to ignore. And it set the stage for something far worse, when royal attention turned from one Boleyn sister to the other. In February 1520, Mary Boleyn married William Carey, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. It was a respectable match. Not wealthy, not powerful, but close enough to the king to matter. Henry VIII attended the wedding himself. That single detail tells us more than pages of commentary ever could. Royal attendance transformed a private union into a political fact. It meant approval. It meant visibility. And visibility, in the Tudor court, was never neutral. Not long after the marriage, Mary's life changed again, quietly, efficiently, without record of consent. According to the transcript, she is widely believed to have become the king's mistress. The exact timing is debated. Some place it soon after the wedding in 1520, others closer to 1522, when royal grants began to flow to William Carey. Often the clearest administrative sign that a woman had entered the king's favor. What matters here is not the date. What matters is the pattern. When Henry VIII noticed a woman, the court moved instantly to accommodate him. Mary did not leave her husband. She did not announce anything. She did not negotiate terms. The system did that for her. William Carey benefited almost immediately. Grants, offices, royal favor, enough to ensure loyalty, enough to ensure silence. This was how Tudor power worked, not through declarations, but through transactions that left no fingerprints. History later blamed Mary. She was called weak, promiscuous, careless. But the transcript insists on a colder truth. Once the king decided, there was nothing anyone could do to stop him, not even her father. Thomas Boleyn, by this point, was an experienced courtier. He understood exactly what was happening. He also understood the limits of his influence. He could not confront the king. He could not remove Mary again. He could not publicly object without destroying what remained of his family's security. The transcript describes him as powerless. That word is not chosen lightly. In Tudor England, power did not mean status. It meant proximity to the king's will. And when that will turned personal, all other authority dissolved. There is a surviving letter from Thomas to his other daughter, and that hints, carefully, at his distress. He expresses concern for honor and female chastity. The language is restrained, almost coded, but its meaning is unmistakable. He disapproved, he worried, and he could not intervene. This is the first moment where the myth of the manipulative Boleyn father truly collapses. If Thomas had been orchestrating his daughter's intimacy with Henry VIII, this affair would have been celebrated, not avoided. Instead, Thomas distanced himself from Mary, not out of cruelty, but because closeness now carried danger. Mary's position as the king's mistress placed the entire family under scrutiny. Every word could be misread, every action interpreted as calculation. The safest option was silence. Mary remained at court. William Carey enjoyed the benefits. Thomas stepped back and, meanwhile, remained abroad longer, continuing her education in a world shaped by dynastic calculation. She was learning languages, manners, music, but also restraint. The art of being seen without being consumed. This is the contradiction at the heart of Thomas Boleyn's choices. He was placing his daughter close to power precisely because he believed education could act as armor. But in Tudor Europe, armor did not stop kings. The same proximity that sharpened Anne's intelligence would later draw the attention of a man who did not interpret refinement as boundary, but as invitation. Thomas could not know that yet. In 1513 to 1514, when and moved between courts, Henry VIII was married, distracted, and still hopeful of producing a male heir with Catherine of Aragon. The danger was not obvious. It was not inevitable. And that is what makes this stage of the story so unsettling. The imbalance is striking. The woman absorbed the moral judgment. The husband received financial reward. The king faced no consequence at all. This is the true crime at the heart of the Tudor court. Desire was political. Sex was administrative. And women's bodies became sites of negotiation they never agreed to enter. The transcript is careful not to sensationalize Mary's role, and neither should we. There is no proof that she sought the king's attention. There is no record of her consent. There is only the familiar pattern of Tudor governance. A king takes interest, and the court arranges the rest. For Mary, the consequences were permanent. Once labeled the king's mistress, she could never return to anonymity. Her name would follow her. Her reputation would be rewritten by others. Any future choice she made would be interpreted through this single fact. For Thomas, this was a warning he could not ignore. He had believed education could shield his daughters. He had believed proximity could be managed. He had believed that careful positioning offered control. Mary proved him wrong. No amount of preparation mattered once the king intervened. No father could protect a daughter whose body had entered the king's orbit. And yet, this is crucial. Thomas did not capitalize on the situation. He did not push Mary further forward. He did not leverage her position to extract more titles or power. The grants flowed to Carey, not to him. Thomas gained nothing directly. What he gained instead was knowledge. He saw what happened when a Boleyn woman caught the king's eye. He saw how quickly admiration turned into possession. He saw how easily honor could be erased, and how impossible it was to restore. This knowledge would shape everything that followed. Because soon, very soon, Henry VIII's attention would shift. From Mary, compliant, married, quietly absorbed, to Anne, and would refuse the role Mary had been forced to play. She would not become a mistress. She would not accept secrecy. She would demand legitimacy. The court would call that ambition. History would call it manipulation. But Thomas Boleyn, watching from the edge, had already learned the truth. Once the king chose, no one truly chose at all. Not the woman, not her husband, and certainly not her father. The affair with Mary was not a stepping stone to power. It was a warning, a demonstration of what royal desire did to women and to the men who loved them. And Thomas Boleyn would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to prevent that lesson from repeating itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to England in late 1521, it was not because her father was preparing her for a royal romance. It was because a family dispute, old, bitter, and unresolved, had reached a critical point. For years, Thomas Boleyn had pursued the earldom of Ormond, a title he believed should pass to him through his mother, Margaret Butler. The claim was weak. Another branch of the family, led by Piers Butler, contested it fiercely. The dispute dragged on through courts and corridors, unresolved and increasingly inconvenient. Power in Tudor England did not tolerate loose ends. A solution was proposed, one that treated marriage not as affection, but as legal glue, and Boleyn would marry James Butler, Piers Butler's son and heir. The union would merge both claims and end the conflict. It was not a romantic idea. It was a practical one, and for a time, it was seriously pursued, under the watchful encouragement of Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister. The plan advanced as late as January 1522, and then it collapsed. Why it failed is not fully recorded. The transcript is careful here, and so must we be. It may have been Thomas's reluctance. Marrying and into the Butler line would weaken his own claim. It may have been political calculation, or it may simply have been that in Tudor England, arrangements only held as long as the king's attention allowed them to. What matters is the result. Anne did not marry James Butler. The Ormond dispute remained unresolved, and Anne was brought home. Upon her return, and entered the household of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's wife. This placement was conventional, respectable. It signaled nothing more than that, and was now a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. At least, that is how it appeared. Thomas Boleyn, meanwhile, continued to serve the crown abroad. In 1522, he traveled again on diplomatic missions, this time enduring experiences that nearly killed him. According to the transcript, his ship ran aground near Falmouth. Some of his companions drowned. When they set sail again, they were attacked by Breton ships. They escaped narrowly. Thomas did not return home until June 1523. These details matter because they underline a pattern. Thomas was not hovering at court, maneuvering his daughter into the king's path. He was absent, on the king's business, risking his life. In 1525, his long service was recognized. He was appointed a Knight of the Garter, one of the highest honors in England. Shortly afterward, he was raised to the peerage as Viscount Rochford. This promotion did not depend on it. According to the transcript, Henry VIII was not known for greatly rewarding the families of his mistresses, and the timing matters. Thomas's elevation came before Anne's relationship with the king began, before it could be used as explanation or excuse. By this point, Thomas Boleyn was already successful, already wealthy, already a viscount. The image of a desperate father pushing a daughter toward the throne does not fit the chronology. But something else was changing. By the mid-1520s, Henry VIII was losing patience with his marriage. Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce a surviving male heir. His hopes were fading, his affection cooling, and his attention, always restless, was searching for a new focus. And Boleyn was now visible. She had returned from Europe fluent in French, educated in continental court culture, sharper and more composed than the young women Henry was accustomed to. She stood out, not because she was pushed forward, but because she could not be ignored. This is the moment where Thomas's long-term investment turned against him. Everything and had been taught to speak carefully, to observe power, to maintain distance, made her different. And difference attracted Henry's eye. The trap did not spring all at once. At first, there was nothing public, no scandal, no declaration, and had been in Catherine's household for years by the time the king truly noticed her. She was not new. She was simply no longer invisible. Thomas Boleyn could not have engineered this. He had spent much of this period away from court. His attention was divided between diplomatic duties and the Ormond claim. There is no evidence, within the transcript or surviving records, that he encouraged Henry's interest. No letters, no instructions, no recorded pressure. What he did have was experience. He had watched what happened to Mary. He knew what royal attention did to women who could not refuse it. And now he saw that attention drifting toward his other daughter. This is where the meaning of this phase becomes clear. Thomas had believed education could prepare and for court life. He had believed careful placement could control risk. He had believed that marriages could be arranged to stabilize claims and end disputes. But Henry VIII did not operate within those calculations. When the king's desire shifted, every plan built on logic collapsed. The Ormond marriage failed. The diplomatic missions ended. The careful rise paused. And Boleyn, once an investment in stability, became something else entirely. She became the focus of a king who no longer believed his wife could give him what he wanted. From that moment on, education ceased to be protection. It became exposure. The same polish that made an exceptional now made her dangerous, to herself and to everyone who loved her. And Thomas Boleyn, watching the pattern repeat, could already sense what was coming. Because in the Tudor court, when the king changed his mind, history did not bend. It cut. By 1526, according to the transcript, Henry VIII had begun to focus his attention on Anne Boleyn. At first, nothing was declared. No announcement. No open breach. What existed instead was pressure, quiet, persistent, and entirely one-sided. And did not respond as her sister had. She did not accept gifts. She did not agree to secrecy. According to the logic of the Tudor court, this refusal was extraordinary and dangerous. Kings were accustomed to compliance. Resistance did not end desire. It intensified it. For years, historians assumed that Anne's stance must have been engineered by her father. That Thomas Boleyn, having seen Mary's fall, now aimed higher, turning resistance into leverage, marriage into ambition. But the transcript introduces a piece of evidence that fractures that story. It comes not from family letters or later apology, but from imperial diplomatic correspondence, the kind written without expectation of sympathy. In 1533, Eustace Chapuis, the ambassador of Emperor Charles V, reported conversations he had recorded while observing events at the English court. Chapuis was not neutral. He was openly hostile to Anne. He opposed Henry's break with Rome. He had no incentive to soften the Boleyn's image. And yet, according to Chapuis, the version of Thomas Boleyn he heard did not fit the caricature. Chapuis writes, Lot Chapuis, the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's powerful uncle, claimed Thomas had initially opposed the marriage. More than that, Norfolk stated that Thomas had pretended to be mad, feigning instability, in order to gain room to resist the match more effectively. This is not the behavior of a man pushing his daughter toward a throne. It is the behavior of a man trying to delay something he believes cannot end well. Norfolk's statement matters for two reasons. First, Norfolk had no reason to invent it. By 1533, Anne was already queen. The marriage had happened. The danger of opposition was over. If Thomas had been an enthusiastic supporter from the beginning, it would have reflected well on the family. Instead, Norfolk describes reluctance, resistance that needed to be hidden behind performance. Second, Chapuis reports that Anne herself knew this. And this is where the story turns. According to the same diplomatic letter, an incident occurred while Anne was already pregnant, after the marriage, after the crown, after the point of no return, and had altered her gown, enlarging it in the way women did when expecting a child. Thomas noticed and told her she ought to remove the addition, that she should be thankful to God to find herself in such a condition, and did not respond privately. She snapped back, publicly, before witnesses. Present, according to Chapuis, were Duke of Suffolk, the Duke of Norfolk himself, and the treasurer of the household, and said she was in better condition than her father would have desired. The meaning is unmistakable, and was not accusing her father of ambition. She was accusing him of reluctance. Even after she had become queen, even while carrying the king's child, and understood that Thomas had not wanted this path. She knew he had tried, quietly, indirectly, to stop it. This single exchange dismantles a century of assumption. If Thomas had engineered the marriage, Anne's anger would make no sense. If he had pushed her forward, she would not have thrown his resistance back at him as an insult. Instead, what we see is a fracture between father and daughter created not by ambition, but by disagreement. Anne wanted legitimacy. Thomas feared consequence. The transcript is careful to acknowledge limits. This evidence comes from diplomatic letters. We cannot know every motive. We cannot hear Thomas's voice directly. There are no diaries, no confessions, only observation and report. But diplomatic reports exist to inform emperors of political realities, not to create family myths. And the reality Chapuis records is inconvenient. It suggests that Thomas Boleyn, having watched Mary's fate, recognized a pattern, that he understood Henry VIII well enough to know how swiftly favor turned lethal, that he saw danger not in rejection, but in proximity. Why would he oppose the marriage? Several possibilities appear in the transcript, and none can be proven absolutely. It may have been conscience. Biblical law forbade a king from marrying his brother's widow, and Thomas was raised in a world where such rules mattered. It may have been distress, watching one daughter already damaged by the same man. Or it may have been simple experience. Thomas had served Henry for decades. He had seen women rise and fall. He had seen affection harden into indifference. He had seen how quickly usefulness expired. What he had not seen, what no one in 1526 could predict, was that Henry would break with Rome, dismantle a church, and marry an English woman to satisfy his desire. From Thomas's perspective, the risk was unprecedented. And yet, resistance had limits. Once Anne refused to become a mistress, and once Henry refused to let go, the balance shifted. Thomas could delay. He could posture. He could pretend to be unwell or unfit to intervene. But he could not stop a king who had decided. Between 1527 and 1533, Thomas adapted. Not because he believed the marriage was wise, but because opposition had become suicidal. To resist openly would not save Anne. It would destroy what remained of the family. This is the moral core of the episode. Thomas Boleyn did not begin as the architect of Anne's rise. He became a supporter when resistance no longer protected anyone. And that distinction matters. History often compresses events into intention. It turns adaptation into design. But the evidence here, knock osid shopwees, suggests something more uncomfortable. A father can be right about danger. He can warn, he can resist, and still be forced to participate in the outcome he feared. And knew this. Her sharp remark was not political theater. It was personal, a reminder, spoken aloud, that the path she walked was not the one her father had chosen for her. And that knowledge, shared, acknowledged, and unresolved, would haunt both of them. Because once the marriage was complete, once the child was conceived, once the crown rested on Anne's head, there was no returning to caution, only forward, toward consequences Thomas Boleyn had tried, and failed, to prevent. This is where the old story breaks apart, not because Thomas was innocent, but because he was not the puppeteer history imagined. He was a man who recognized a trap, and watched it close anyway. By the late 1520s, resistance was no longer a position Thomas Boleyn could hold. Between 1527 and 1533, according to the transcript, and made her decision unmistakably clear. She would not become the king's mistress. She would not accept secrecy or half-status. If Henry wanted her, it would be as his wife, or not at all. That choice changed everything. For Thomas Boleyn, it marked the end of delay and the beginning of alignment. Not because he suddenly believed the marriage was wise, but because refusal no longer protected anyone. Opposition had become dangerous. Silence had become insufficient. So Thomas gave in, not publicly at first, not enthusiastically, but decisively. The moment this shift became irreversible came in 1529, during the proceedings examining the validity of Catherine of Aragon's marriage to Henry VIII. At the center of the case stood a question that would decide a queen's fate. Had Catherine's first marriage to Henry's older brother been consummated? If it had, Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid under biblical law, and Thomas Boleyn was called to testify. He stated that he had been present at the wedding of Prince Arthur and Catherine in 1501. More than that, he claimed that the following morning he heard Prince Arthur boast that the marriage had been consummated. This single statement carried immense weight. It reached back nearly 30 years. It rested on memory, and it aligned perfectly with what the king needed to hear. The transcript is careful here, and so must we be. Several other witnesses gave similar testimony, also recalling events from decades earlier. Some historians believe Arthur's words were widely repeated at the time. Others argue that these memories may have been shaped by political necessity. We cannot know Thomas's private thoughts, but we can measure the consequence. Catherine of Aragon never changed her position. She consistently denied that her marriage to Arthur had been consummated. She held to that denial until her death. Thomas's testimony strengthened the king's case. Whether he spoke from conviction or calculation, the result was the same. He helped dismantle the legal foundation of a reigning queen's marriage. This is where Thomas Boleyn crosses an ethical threshold. He had once resisted the marriage between Henry and Anne. Now he was helping remove the woman standing in its way, and the reward followed swiftly. In 1529, Thomas finally achieved what he had pursued for years. He was made Earl of Ormond, securing the Irish title he had long claimed. At the same time, he was created Earl of Wiltshire, giving him an English earldom as well. These honors did not come in isolation. They arrived at the precise moment Thomas ceased to be merely cautious and became useful. History often presents this as proof of motive. Titles gained, therefore ambition revealed. But the transcript complicates that judgment. Thomas did not begin this path to gain titles. He reached this point after resistance had failed. The question is not whether he benefited. The question is what it cost. That cost was not abstract. In June 1528, while the political machinery moved forward, William Carey, Mary Boleyn's husband, died of the sweating sickness, a fast-moving and terrifying illness. Mary was left widowed and nearly destitute, and Thomas did nothing. According to the transcript, it was Henry VIII who eventually ordered Thomas to provide financial support for his daughter. Not persuasion, not negotiation, an order. This detail exposes a fracture no title can conceal. Thomas had aligned himself with the king's cause, but in doing so, he had distanced himself from the daughter whose life had already been damaged by that same king. Mary was not a political threat. She was not defiant. She was simply inconvenient. And Thomas, now fully enmeshed in the machinery of royal will, allowed that inconvenience to persist until intervention came from above. This is the darkest mark against him. Not because he failed to protect Mary from the king, no one could, but because once she was no longer useful, once she no longer fit the trajectory of advancement, he let her fall away. The transcript does not soften this, nor should we. Thomas Boleyn may have been cautious. He may have foreseen danger. He may even have tried to stop what was coming. But at this stage, he chose survival within the system over loyalty outside it. And that choice had victims. This is the moral weight of 1529. A father who once resisted now testified. A courtier who once delayed now facilitated. A man who feared the king's power now helped give it legal cover. The story does not ask us to condemn him outright. It asks something harder. Can survival erase complicity? Thomas Boleyn did not design the system that destroyed Catherine of Aragon's marriage. He did not invent the rules that allowed kings to rewrite truth through testimony. But when the moment came, he participated, and he was rewarded. Titles were restored. Claims were settled. Security appeared briefly. Mary remained marginalized. Catherine was discarded, and moved closer to a crown built on legal ruin. This is not the portrait of a villain driven by naked ambition. It is the portrait of a man who crossed a line because refusing to cross it meant annihilation. Whether that makes him guilty or merely human is the question this part of the story refuses to answer for us. It leaves us instead with the quiet, uncomfortable truth at the heart of Tudor power. Sometimes the most damaging acts are not committed by monsters. They are committed by men who decide, once, that survival matters more than resistance. And once that decision is made, there is no clean way back. Power at the Tudor court did not decline gently. It collapsed. When Cardinal Wolsey failed to secure Henry VIII's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, his position became untenable. For years, Wolsey had been the engine of royal policy, the man who negotiated treaties, controlled patronage, and absorbed the king's anger so others did not have to. But usefulness was his only protection. Once he could no longer deliver the divorce, that protection vanished. The fall was swift. Titles stripped, authority dissolved, charges assembled, and Thomas Boleyn, who had once worked closely with Wolsey, did not stand aside. According to the transcript, Thomas helped assemble parliamentary accusations against the cardinal. This was not ideological zeal. It was procedural alignment. Wolsey was finished, and survival meant understanding which way the court was turning. After Wolsey's death in 1530, Thomas went further. He staged a farce, a crude, symbolic performance for the French ambassador, depicting Wolsey being dragged into hell. The ambassador did not appreciate it. The display was tasteless, vindictive, and revealing, because it showed something Thomas had learned. In Henry VIII's court, it was not enough to watch a powerful man fall. You were expected to participate. This was not merely cruelty. It was insurance. Public mockery served a purpose. It demonstrated loyalty to the new order and severed any lingering association with the old. Thomas Boleyn, experienced and perceptive, understood that neutrality was dangerous. Silence could be misread as sympathy. So he joined the chorus. At the same time, Thomas's political posture hardened. As negotiations with Rome stalled and imperial pressure increased, his attitude toward the papacy and Spanish influence grew sharper. In October 1530, Eustace Chapuis recorded a conversation in which Thomas spoke so harshly about the Pope that Chapuis excused himself. He later described Thomas and as more Lutherans than Luther himself. The transcript is careful here, and rightly so. This description likely exaggerates. Thomas did not abandon Catholicism. There are multiple instances where he later tried to protect accused priests, even when it placed him at odds with and the king. But the shift in tone was real. Frustration had replaced patience. Rome had become an obstacle, Spain a threat, and compromise no longer felt viable. What matters is not whether Thomas became a religious radical. It is that he learned how quickly the court demanded visible allegiance, and how mercilessly it punished hesitation. This lesson did not go unnoticed. Someone was watching. Thomas Cromwell had risen through Wolsey's household. He had survived his master's fall by stepping aside at precisely the right moment. And now he was observing how men like Boleyn and Norfolk behaved once power changed hands. Cromwell saw the mechanics clearly. A great man could be dismantled in days. Former allies would lead the process. Public humiliation would replace private loyalty. This was not chaos. It was method. Thomas Boleyn, in helping tear down Wolsey, helped establish a precedent. No position was permanent, and mercy was not a political value. The court learned to perform its loyalty loudly, and to erase yesterday's power without regret. Thomas may have believed he was protecting his family by adapting, by proving that he understood the new rules. And in the short term, it worked. He remained in favor. He continued to dine with the king. He advanced. But precedent has a habit of returning. What Thomas could not see, what no one could afford to acknowledge, was that the same techniques used against Wolsey could be used against anyone, including the family that now stood closest to the throne. Cromwell, methodical and unsentimental, absorbed the lesson. He learned how accusations were assembled, how evidence was shaped, how speed replaced deliberation, how fear did the work of proof. And when the time came, he would not hesitate. This is why Wolsey's fall matters in this story, not because Thomas Boleyn destroyed him, but because Thomas demonstrated how destruction worked. In trying to survive the Tudor court, Thomas helped sharpen its most dangerous weapon, and someone else learned how to wield it better. When that weapon was finally turned on the Boleyns, it would not look like betrayal. It would look like procedure, like loyalty, like the natural order of things.
And Thomas Boleyn, who had watched a giant fall and joined the applause, would recognize the pattern too late, because in Henry VIII's England, the lesson was brutally simple. If a powerful man could fall overnight, then no one, no matter how close to the king, was ever safe. The year 1536 did not begin with violence. It began with removal.
In January, Catherine of Aragon died. According to the transcript, Thomas Boleyn greeted the news with cruelty, remarks so cold they shocked even seasoned observers. He reportedly said it was a shame the king's daughter Mary had not died as well. It was a terrible statement, selfish, unforgivable, and yet it also revealed something else. With Catherine gone, the last obstacle to Anne's security vanished. The king would not need to reconcile with a living wife. He could move on cleanly, quickly, too quickly. At the end of January 1536, and Boleyn miscarried a son. The loss was physical, immediate, and catastrophic. The body failed where the crown demanded success. In the Tudor court, that failure was not private. Within weeks, Henry VIII's attention shifted to Jane Seymour. This was not romance. It was replacement. The machinery Thomas had watched dismantle Wolsey now turned its gears toward his own family. On May 2nd, 1536, and was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She was accused of treason and adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The speed was shocking. There were no warnings, no gradual loss of favor, no period of uncertainty. This was procedure executed at pace. The charges were assembled under the direction of Thomas Cromwell, the same man who had learned, years earlier, how quickly a powerful figure could be dismantled, and how little evidence was required once the king had decided. The trials that followed were not investigations. They were confirmations. On May 17th, George Boleyn and 4 other men were executed on Tower Hill. 2 days later, on May 19th, and was executed within the Tower walls, buried beside her brother in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. From arrest to death, the process took just over 2 weeks. This is the core horror of 1536. Not betrayal, not passion, but velocity. At the center of it all stood Thomas Boleyn, an experienced diplomat who had navigated emperors and popes, who understood timing and leverage better than most men alive. And yet, he did nothing. He did not see his children during their imprisonment. No letters from him survive. He was not present at the trials of and/or George. He did not sit on the jury that condemned them. Instead, according to the transcript, Thomas was compelled to serve on a commission judging the 4 commoners accused alongside his children. He condemned those men while his own son and daughter awaited execution elsewhere. It is difficult to imagine a more brutal position. Shopweis later recorded rumors that Thomas was ready to assist in the judgments on the day of Anne's death. But the transcript is careful, and so must we be. Shopweis does not name his source. We do not know whether the claim is accurate. We only know that rumors filled the vacuum left by Thomas's silence. And silence is all we have. Thomas did not publicly protest. He did not plead. He did not resign in defiance. He continued to serve the king. This is the question that divides every interpretation of his life. Was that silence complicity, or was it survival? By 1536, Thomas had learned the cost of resistance. He had watched Wolsey fall. He had seen how speed replaced mercy. He knew that once Henry's mind was made up, opposition did not delay death, it multiplied it. Open defiance would not have saved Anne. It would not have saved George. It might only have destroyed what remained of the family. The system had already moved beyond him. The charges were absurd in places. The timelines impossible. The annulment that followed, declaring Anne's marriage invalid, made the accusations of adultery legally incoherent. How could a woman commit adultery if she had never been a wife? The question did not matter. Law was not the engine here. Decision was. For Thomas, the collapse was total. In a single sweep, he lost 2 of his 3 children. He lost his standing as the king's father-in-law. He lost the influence he had built over decades. Everything he had constructed, carefully, patiently, was stripped away at once. And the cruelty did not end with death. Henry VIII ensured the annulment of his marriage to Anne, erasing her queenship as efficiently as he erased her body. He moved forward without pause. The court followed. The records adjusted. Thomas remained. He bowed again, signed again, served again, not because he had won, but because he had survived. This is what makes 1536 unbearable to confront. The tragedy is not that a father failed to save his children. No one could have saved them once the machinery engaged. The tragedy is that the system required him to keep functioning afterward, to condemn others, to attend court, to continue under the gaze of the man who had destroyed his family. Was Thomas silent because he agreed, or because by then, silence was the only language left to him? The transcript refuses to answer that question for us. It leaves us instead with the evidence of speed, of process, of a court that killed not in anger, but in routine. In Tudor England, death did not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it arrived with efficiency, and when it did, even the most seasoned men who understood power better than anyone, found themselves reduced to witnesses. Thomas Boleyn had spent his life learning how to survive near the throne. In 1536, that knowledge saved him. It did not save his children, and it did not save his conscience. Whether history should judge him for that, or recognize it as the final cruelty of a system that offered no clean choices, is the question that 1536 leaves behind, one that cannot be resolved by speed. Death was not the end of Thomas Boleyn's punishment. Survival was. After 1536, the court did not banish him. It did something colder. It kept him close and stripped him piece by piece. Thomas lost the office of Lord Privy Seal. The position passed to Thomas Cromwell, the man who had overseen the destruction of his family. Authority did not merely change hands. It was transferred as a reminder. The losses continued. In 1538, the earldom of Ormond, the title Thomas had fought for since 1515, was taken from him and returned to the Butler line. The transcript is careful. We do not know who advised the king to do this, but Cromwell was managing the process. The effect was unmistakable. 23 years of effort erased with a signature. Then came the extraction. Henry VIII and Cromwell continued to demand money, rents, subsidies, every available penny. This was not policy. It was pressure. The court squeezed what remained from a man who could no longer resist. Thomas complied because compliance was the price of breathing. In July 1536, just 6 weeks after Anne and George were executed, Thomas was ordered to provide financial support for Jane Parker Boleyn, his widowed daughter-in-law. The transcript notes that he agreed only because the king demanded it. His finances were already much decayed. It is possible, no more than possible, that this was not merely miserliness. Every payment would have reopened the wound. Every obligation would have carried the name of the son he had lost. Survival required distance, and distance looked like cruelty. The court did not allow distance for long. In October 1537, Thomas was summoned to Hampton Court Palace for the baptism of Prince Edward, the long-awaited male heir born to Jane Seymour. The boy Henry had wanted, had broken marriages for, now lived. Thomas attended. 4-year-old Princess Elizabeth was present as well. It is difficult to imagine a more precise form of cruelty. A grandfather who had lost his daughter to an executioner stood at a ceremony celebrating the son who replaced her claim. He watched his granddaughter, and child, reduced from heir to afterthought, standing within arm's reach of the future that had erased her mother. Was it an honor? Or was it a sentence carried out in silken prayer? A few weeks later, Thomas attended Jane Seymour's funeral. She had died of childbed fever just 12 days after Edward's birth. The body that had succeeded Anne's had failed in a different way. The court mourned. The king grieved. And Thomas watched another woman be consumed by the same system, this time with sympathy instead of accusation. By 1538, what remained of Thomas's private world collapsed as well. His wife, Elizabeth Howard, died, possibly of tuberculosis. She had shared the early poverty, the births, the burials, the rise, and the fall. Now she was gone. Thomas retreated to Hever Castle. He still appeared at court when required. He attended New Year's festivities in 1538. He traveled with the king's entourage later that year, performing the motions expected of him. But the life had drained out of it. What remained was habit. In March 1539, Thomas Boleyn died at Hever. He was around 62 years old. Henry VIII paid for masses to be said for his former father-in-law's soul, a final gesture that could be read as mercy, or his ownership extended beyond death. Thomas left modest provisions, 400 marks a year to his mother, comparatively little to Mary Boleyn, the daughter he had once distanced himself from, though she would later inherit wealth from her grandmother. Much of what remained passed to Princess Elizabeth, the last thread of the family's future. Within a few years, Mary died wealthy. Hever Castle passed to the crown and would later be given to and of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. The house that had raised Anne and George no longer belonged to their blood. This is the final cruelty of Thomas Boleyn's story. He was not executed. He was not imprisoned. He was not erased. He was required to endure, to stand at baptisms, to attend funerals, to pay and bow, and remain present in a court that had taken everything that once gave his life meaning. Execution ends a story quickly. Survival stretches it out. Thomas Boleyn lived long enough to see his daughter replaced, his son forgotten, his titles stripped, his fortune drained, and his granddaughter diminished, then restored only years later, beyond his lifetime. History often reserves its harshest judgment for those who live. But in the Tudor court, survival was not mercy. It was the longest punishment of all. History has never known what to do with Thomas Boleyn. He is too harsh to be a victim, too hesitant to be a mastermind, too compromised to be a hero. The transcript does not ask us to rehabilitate him. It asks us to reconsider the shape of his guilt. Yes, there are moments that stain him. His coldness toward Mary Boleyn, even after her husband's death. His vindictive behavior after Cardinal Wolsey fell. His willingness, in 1529, to give testimony that helped dismantle a queen's marriage. These are not minor failures. They are ethical choices. And yet, the evidence preserved in the transcript points in a direction history has long ignored. There is no proof that Thomas pushed his daughters into the king's bed. There is credible indication, Lot Shopwees, knock Osage to Duke of Norfolk, that he initially opposed Anne's marriage. There is even Anne's own sharp remark, spoken publicly, acknowledging that her father had not wanted this path. That does not absolve him, but it does change the charge. If Thomas Boleyn resisted at first, then adapted later, we are no longer looking at a man driven purely by ambition. We are looking at a man who recognized the danger, failed to stop it, and then chose survival inside a system that punished resistance without mercy. What he thought in private, we will never know. There are no diaries, no confessional letters, no final explanation. Only actions, some cautious, some cruel, some irreversibly complicit. History prefers simple villains. But Tudor power did not operate on simple lines. Henry VIII destroyed women, erased marriages, and rewrote law to suit desire. Many men benefited. Many men assisted. Thomas Boleyn was one of them. But he was also a father who buried children, watched another beheaded, and then lived long enough to stand at the baptism of the child who replaced her. That is not triumph. That is endurance. History calls him a monster. But perhaps the more disturbing truth is this. He was a man who saw the trap early, warned against it, and still could not stop it. And in the Tudor court, being right did not save you. It only meant you lived long enough to watch everything you feared come true. So the question this story leaves behind is not whether Thomas Boleyn was guilty. It is this: who truly pays the price for royal power? And who survives long enough to appear innocent?